Good morning and welcome to another study in God's Word. We are in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. This is episode number 9 of our study of the book of Hebrews. We have been talking about and looking at some ideas in the first four chapters of exactly answering this question: who is Jesus? Who is this Jesus who came on the scene? What did he accomplish? What did he actually do? We have looked at the statements that were made that he is not an angel. He is not just a prophet, though he did come with a lot of prophetic things that he did. He was the fulfillment of prophecy more than coming as a prophet in the same way as the Old Testament. He was not just a man, he is fully God. He is also our high priest. We talked also about this idea of finding a permanent rest, of finding rest, and that we can cease from our striving and cease from our works in order to get God to be okay with us. Jesus himself said in the book of Matthew, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble. And so Jesus said, if you are weary, come to him and you will find rest. And even the idea behind the Sabbath rest is ultimately fulfilled in who Jesus is. He is our Sabbath rest. We can cease striving, cease performing, cease trying to make God be okay with us. We have rest in Jesus himself. And as that, he becomes our ultimate high priest. And that's what we've started looking at in the previous chapter, that Jesus is our ultimate high priest. And that thought is going to continue on as we get into chapter 5 today, and we look at verses 1 through 11. So let's dive into this and break this down verse by verse, word by word, as we have been through all of our studies in the Bible. So it starts in this way. The writer of Hebrews starts with this simple phrase, for every high priest taken from among men. And I just want to stop right there and just kind of note and look at that phrase that he just says, for every high priest taken from among men. God established both the priesthood and the office of the high priest in the days of Moses. It's described in the book of Exodus, chapter 28, and following that. And the writer of Hebrews is really summarizing the work of the high priest in saying that the next statement, he offers both gifts and sacrifices for sins. That was the primary job of the high priest. It was to officiate either directly or indirectly through lower ranking priests all of the sacrifices unto the Lord. So, for every high priest taken from among men. Now, where did the high priests come from? They came from among men. They were a part of God's order and God's system, and they were taken from among men. Therefore, for Jesus to be our ultimate high priest, he had to be taken from among mankind. He had to become a man in order to be the ultimate picture of the high priest. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may both offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. Now, the phrase gifts and sacrifices for sins just reminds us that every sacrifice offered a blood atonement for sin. Many of the ritual sacrifices were intended as simple gifts to God, expressing thanks and desiring fellowship. And so that was his purpose. He came, or that's the purpose of the high priest. The purpose was to he offered both gifts and sacrifices for sins. God set up the priesthood in order to, in the Old Testament, make a way that people could be atoned for, and the high priest would be the representative. He would be the mediator that would be the go-between between God and sinful mankind. God in perfection, mankind who is sinful, needs a mediator to bridge the gap between us, and that was the purpose of the high priest. He would offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins to God on behalf of sinful people. He did so, and it says that of this high priest, he can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. And so again, this is talking about what the high priest is like. The high priest can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, because since he himself is also just like them. He is also a man who can be ignorant and go astray. If the high priest can be ignorant and go astray, then therefore he can empathize with and have compassion on the people that he is representing. He is the high priest is he's more than just a person who performs sacrifices, more than just like a meat cutter, offering animals for sacrifice. He also, part of his office was to show compassion on the people that were ignorant and going astray. So the high priest wasn't just there to do the sacrificial rituals. He showed compassion in his ministry. He ministered, uh, you know, aside from the atoning sacrifices, he ministered to people with a loving heart for the people. This is what the ideal priest would be like. He would offer both compassion and he would be the mediator to go between God and sinful mankind. Now, God made specific commands to help the high priest in order to be able to minister with compassion. If you look at any pictures of what the high priest would look like, they would always have a breastplate that would be on the high priest, and on that breastplate there would be 12 stones, and on those 12 stones would be engraved the names of the tribes of Israel. On the shoulder straps of the high priest would be also 12 stones, or I'm sorry, would be engraved, 12 stones that would be engraved with the names of the tribes of Israel. So they were on his heart and on his shoulder. Israel, the people of Israel, were always to be on the heart and the shoulder of the high priest. In Exodus chapter 28, verses 4 through 30, it talks about this idea directly. The intention was that the high priest would be both filled with compassion and that the high priest would be a perfect mediator. So I want you to keep those two thoughts in mind, that the high priest would be filled with compassion and the high priest would be able to sympathize with those who were ignorant and weak, and the high priest would be a mediator. So his heart would be covered with Israel, and his shoulders would bear the burdens of Israel. In the same way that those gems, those stones, were engraved with the tribes, the high priest carried upon his heart and on the burden of his shoulders the people. Now, if you can I understand this, you are getting a glimpse of Jesus. Jesus, as our high priest, has compassion. He carries in his heart his people. He carries upon his shoulders the burdens that his people could never bear. He comes as the perfect mediator, as the go-between between sinful man and between God. And the high priest has to come from, remember this, among men. That is where the high priest comes from. Keep going. Because of this, the high priest, because he carries compassion and he is the mediator, the high priest is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. God made specific commands in order to help the high priest serve, knowing that the high priest, every other high priest, was subject to weaknesses. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest would first have to offer a sacrifice for himself to remind himself and the nation that he himself was needing atonement, and then he would be able to offer a sacrifice on behalf of the people. He was not better than the people. He was just appointed as the mediator for the people. And he would offer sacrifices first for himself and then for the people. You can look at Leviticus 16, 1 through 6 if you want to find out more information about that. So let's keep going. Final verse or final statement that we have here. Excuse me. And no man takes his honor by himself. So I want you to notice this. No man takes honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. Now, this is going to talk about the purpose of the high priest or the calling of the high priest. No high priest can appoint themselves. No high priest can just declare that they are a high priest. Instead, the high priest has to be called by God, and the high priest started back with a person named Aaron. Now, the person of Aaron in the Old Testament was Moses' brother. The high priest was taken from the community of God's people, but he was not chosen by God's people. This was not by popular vote. God's high priest was chosen by God himself. He was appointed by God for God's people. And the principle that he just said was this: he takes no honor by himself or for himself or to himself. It is all chosen by God. The office of the high priest was nothing to aspire to. It was nothing to campaign for. It was given by right of birth, and therefore chosen by God because God is over his creation. It was a right of birth. God placed people into families how he wanted, into positions that he wanted. It was chosen by God. It was not an honor that a person could, again, campaign for or take for themselves. Now, the true priesthood, the high priest, always came out of a specific line of descent. It started with the person in the Old Testament by the name of Jacob. Now, let me give you just a quick little Old Testament background that you can go and read yourself if you'd like to. But Jacob was you remember the story of Isaac having his sons Jacob and Esau. Esau was the firstborn. Jacob was the twin. He came out second. He came out holding onto the heel of his brother. Esau became really the head of the Arab nation. It came out. That's where a lot of it split. It split in two ways. It split between Isaac and Ishmael. That was the previous generation, and then it would also split between Esau and Jacob. So Ishmael and Esau became the head of the Arab nation that we know today. And they have always been at war with the nation of Israel. Now, who is the nation of Israel? Well, Jacob, after he wrestled with God, after he got his life turned around and his life right with God, wrestled with God, and in that wrestling got his life turned around, God changed his name, and he changed his name from Jacob into Israel. This was the foundation of the nation. Israel would have, or Jacob would have, whose name was changed to Israel, he would have 12 sons. That each of the sons became one of the members of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. So I don't know if I have 6 of them there. 12 tribes of Israel were the 12 sons of Jacob himself. Now, one of the nations, or one of the sons, was named Levi. Out of the son Levi became the tribe known as the Levites. Out of the tribe of the Levites, this would become the priestly line. The priests would come out of this tribe. They would function in the role of a tribe, and they would serve God in that capacity. Every one of the Levites would function as a priest, and they would work in that role. You can look at Exodus 13, Numbers chapter 3, which really expands on this idea. Now, Levi had 3 sons. He had Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Each of these family lines had their own duties, and so he split it up even further. Out of one family, out of the Gershon family, they were responsible for the tabernacle's screen, the veil. They were responsible for the furnishings. They were responsible, I'm sorry, for the fence, for the curtains. Then you had the family of Kohath, and they were responsible for the tabernacle's furnishings, like the lampstand, or the altar of incense, or the Ark of the Covenant. And then you had the family of Merari, and they had care for the boards and the pillars of the tabernacle and all of the fence that would surround the tabernacle. So they all had a specific role, and all of their families they were Levites, but they did not all have the same kind of function. Now, years later, after Israel was given the 12 sons, 12 tribes, we had one of his sons was named Joseph. He got sold into slavery. He went to Egypt. The rest of the family would follow to Egypt, and we don't have time to go through all of that today. But regardless, there would be a big gap of about 400 years that would happen between the time of Jacob, Israel, Joseph, and the time of Moses coming on the scene. Now, out of Moses, they had these tribes that all had specific duties, and they would have specific duties as they went forward. But out of these tribes that had all of these specific duties, then you have a person by the name of Aaron. Aaron, who was a Levite, would be, and again, the brother of Moses, he would be the first high priest. So you had the Levites that were functioning as priests, but you had specifically those coming out of Aaron who were the high priests. Now, Aaron's family and his descendants made up the majority of the priests, the ones that we would know as the priests, and of the high priest. Now, the other members of the family of the tribe of Levi, they would have roles in the temple and roles in the tabernacle, but they would not be the high priest or the main priests. That would all come out of the family of Aaron. So here's what he's saying in Hebrews. No man can take this honor. You have to be born not only a Levite, but you have to be born out of the line of Aaron as a Levite. And the ones born out of the line of Aaron would be the ones who would serve God as a high priest. You can't campaign for it. You can't work for it. You can't buy it. You can't persuade others to give it to you. It's not a nomination process. It is only those out of the tribe of Levi who came out of the lineage of Aaron that would be the high priests and the priests. Now, there were people in the Old Testament that tried to become priests on their own accord, and you had serious consequences when they did that. People who were not priests but presumed to act as priests. You had example in Numbers chapter 16. You had a person by the name of Korah. Korah was swallowed up in a God ordained earthquake. You had Saul, who was the first king of Israel, who acted in the form of a priest, and he was rejected from his place as king, according to 1 Samuel 13. You also had a guy by the name of Uzziah, who was struck with leprosy in the temple itself, according to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. So God appointed whom he wanted to be the high priest. That is the whole thing that we need to understand. It's not something that we can just do. We can't just call and have that honor. It was specific in the tribe of Levi, out of the lineage of Aaron, and those were the ones that would become the high priests. We could not choose it ourselves. It was God's appointing. Now, what that says then is the next statement. Therefore, Jesus is going to be qualified to be our high priest. Why is that? Let's look. So also, now remember, anytime you see these connecting words, you have to always look back at the previous statement. So also, talking about the priests that did not appoint themselves, that were appointed by God, the priests that came as, so those priests were appointed by God. So it's an appointed by God, appointed by God. That's a divine appointment. The priests were filled with compassion for the people. They carried the burdens of the people in their heart and on their shoulders. They are also the mediators for the people. That's the previous thought that we just had. So also, Messiah, Christ, the anointed one, the Amashiach, did not glorify himself to become high priest. So he did not, what does that mean? He did not glorify himself to become high priest. It means that he did not campaign for this. He did not push his own credentials. He didn't tell everybody that he deserved to be this. He did not come to glorify himself as a high priest. He didn't take hold of that calling, but it was he who said to him. So notice this. Let me just make this a different color. Excuse me, color here. It was he who said to him. Who are the he and the him? That is the Father who said to the Son, Messiah, Jesus. He who said to him, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. In other words, I put you into the line of man, because the high priest has to come out of the line of man. As he, the Father, also says in another place in the Old Testament, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So here's what is being said. God, who did what? He appointed all of the high priests. God appointed another high priest that is his own son, that is Yeshua Jesus himself. God appointed him. Today he was appointed as what? As the ultimate, I'm going to run out of room here, the ultimate high priest. He is not just a priest like these other people, these men who die, who live and serve and then die. He's not like that. He is the ultimate high priest. He is a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. His priesthood, Jesus's priesthood, is unending, unlike all of the other priests that had ever served in the role before Jesus was there. Jesus was the ultimate high priest. Jesus came in and he confronted all of the religious structure, and he confronted the high priests of the day, and he corrupted a corrupt institution. Now, why could Jesus confront that? Well, because he's the ultimate high priest, and he can say how the rest of the priests are failing and falling short and having a horrible religious structure, a corrupt institution, rather than hearts that are filled with compassion and really becoming mediators that God has called them to be. So he has every right to corrupt it, or to confront it, because he is the ultimate high priest. Now, he is this high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. What is that all about? Well, I'm not going to get into that, because Hebrews chapter 7 is going to develop this theme more fully of Jesus being being a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So just wait until we get to chapter 7 and we will dive into that more. Needless to say, Jesus is the ultimate high priest. He is different than any other high priest that ever was there. He is a forever high priest. As a forever high priest, he will then have compassion in his heart, and he will bear a burden on his shoulders, and he will be the ultimate mediator for sinful man and a holy God. He will be the ultimate bridge that will bridge the gap between the two. Let's keep going. So who in the days of his flesh, this is Jesus, when he had offered up prayers and supplications. So who, that again, that is Jesus. In the days of his flesh, what does that mean? When he became a man in the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers and supplications. Now, when did he offer up prayers and supplications? Well, that would have been ultimately the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he offered up prayers with vehement cries and tears to him who is able to save him from death. So think of the Garden of Gethsemane. In Gethsemane, what happened? He offered up prayers and supplications. Remember what he prayed? He said, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Remember, he said to his disciples, stay here and pray with me. Join me in prayer. Why are you keep falling asleep? Be with me in prayer. At that moment, he was offering up prayers and he was offering up supplications. Now, the word supplications, in the Greek, it is the word, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it, but ikteria. And what it means is an olive branch wrapped in wool. Ancient Greek worshippers would often hold up and wave an olive branch wrapped in wool to express their desperate prayer and desire. The word supplication means to extend olive branches with wool. Now, if you think about it, that's ultimately what Jesus is. Jesus offered this prayer in the Garden of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Garden of the Olive Press. And he was the wool himself, being the Lamb of God. So he offered up prayers and supplications with cries and tears. Remember, he was so stressed. There was just pain. There was sweat or blood like sweat, or sweat like blood. If you cut your finger and it's dropping like drops of blood, think of sweat pouring off of you in that manner. He was in stress and turmoil and vehement cries and tears, because he knew what was coming around the corner with the cross. He knew what was going to happen in a physical way to his body. And he was offering these prayers to God, who is able to save him from death. So he offered prayers to his Father, yet he was willing to go through it anyway. Because he said, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." So what that means is this: his prayers were heard because of his godly fear, because of his relationship with the Father, though he was a son. Yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. So Jesus came fully man, yet it says that he still learned obedience. Now, how did he learn obedience? You know, Jesus was God, he is God, and yet he learned obedience. God enthroned in heaven and glory can only experience obedience on the behalf of the people coming to him. He is in perfection. He didn't have to obey; everybody else obeyed him. When Jesus threw off his crown and his thorn or his throne in heaven, and he humbled himself and became a man, he had to learn what we all learn. He learned obedience. Jesus did not. He was never disobedient, but he learned obedience just by actually obeying. Jesus did not learn how to obey, he learned what is involved in obedience. Did you hear that? Jesus didn't learn how to obey, he learned what is involved in obedience. What is involved in obedience? Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. That's what he learned in obedience. That's what he experienced. That was what was involved in obedience. Where you say to God, "It is not my will, but yours. It is what your plan is." God, whatever you plan. Charles Spurgeon once said this about obedience. He said, "Obedience is a trade to which a man must be an apprentice until he has learned it. For it is not known to be known in any other way, or it's not known to be in any other way. Even our blessed Lord could not have fully learned obedience by the observation in others as of such an obedience as he had personally to render." So Jesus had to go through it to really understand what obedience was. He was never disobedient, but he learned what was involved in obedience, and he modeled to us what obedience really looks like. Two final verses. "And having been perfected," so he learned it and he obeyed and he was perfect. And not only was he perfect, he in his death and in his resurrection, his resurrection from the grave, he was now perfect. Not that he wasn't already perfect before, but now he was in his glorified state, in his glorified body. He also became the author of eternal salvation. So the author meaning the writer, the creator, the first. He is the author. He wrote what it was. He explained what it was. He created what it was, and now we all who obey him, called by God as high priest, that's who Jesus is. Again, he's the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say of. So we have much to say about Melchizedek, and that again will come in chapter 7. And hard to explain. It's a hard thing to explain since you have become dull of hearing. So ultimately, Jesus is our high priest. He is a high priest forever. And what did the high priest do? Well, the high priest would make atonement for sin. He would be the mediator, and the high priest would be filled with compassion. High priests in that day would come and go because they would always die, and a new one would be appointed. But Jesus is the ultimate high priest. His priesthood is forever, and we can approach him confidently, knowing that he still sits on his throne of grace. He is full of compassion in his heart. He bears our burdens on his shoulder, and he is the perfect mediator between sinful man and a holy God. Well, that's all we have today. We'll pick it up right there, and actually we'll pick it up in that last statement that I just read on this page. We'll pick it up there in our next devotional. Thank you for joining me today, and have a wonderful, blessed day.